The fog clings low over the fjords, thick and silent, like a secret not yet spoken. Somewhere beyond the veil of mist, a longship rocks gently on the icy tide, its carved dragon prow peering into the unknown. This is not the Viking world you've seen in Hollywood epics. No thundering battles, no flaming villages, just silence, wind, and the raw breath of the north. This is where the story begins, not in war, but in waiting, in listening to the land. The Vikings were not a people, not a nation, not a single tribe. They were a way of life, shaped by the cold hands of the Scandinavian wilderness. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, these were not countries, but regions of frost and fire, of towering forests and frozen soil, stitched together by trade, by blood, and by belief. To understand how the Vikings truly lived, we must first understand how they endured, for theirs was a life of survival, carved out of stone and sea. The average Viking family did not live in a smoky, crowded town. No, they lived in longhouses, wooden structures that stretched like the belly of a ship turned upside down, their roofs thatched with straw or turf. These homes were dark, warm, and communal. In winter, when the snow swallowed the world outside, entire families, sometimes with servants and livestock, lived side by side. They slept on benches by the walls, wrapped in wool and fur, their dreams mingling with the scent of smoke and salted fish. But hardship was constant. Winters were brutal, food was never guaranteed, and the soil was thin and stubborn. They planted barley and rye when they could, but more often they turned to the sea. Fish, seals, and whales were not just resources, they were life. The Viking was not born with a sword, but with a net, a harpoon, a hand hardened by years of rowing and reaping from the deep. Even the children learned the tides before they learned to walk. Yet their world was not only labor and struggle, there was beauty, too. In the early morning light spilling across the fjords, in the fireglow of evening tailies, the Vikings sang. They told stories of gods and monsters, of Odin's one eye and Loki's tricks, of giants that slept beneath the mountains. These stories were not entertainment, they were belief. They explained thunder, lightning, even the shimmering aurora that danced in the polar night. Myth and life were braided together like the threads of their woolen cloaks. Their gods were not distant beings of light and love. No, the Norse gods were flawed, wild, and fierce, just like their worshippers. Thor, the thunderer, with his iron hammer. Freya, the goddess of love and war, who wept golden tears. Odin, the Allfather, who gave an eye for wisdom and hung from the world tree for 9 days to learn the secrets of the runes. These tales were etched into the Vikings' soul, shaping their choices, their rituals, even their deaths. And death was never far away. Childbirth could kill, so could a simple wound. There were no hospitals, no physicians, only the cunning hands of women, wise with herbs and whispered spells. They boiled birch bark and chewed willow for pain, but mostly they endured. They believed in fate, in the threads woven by the Norse ancient spirits who measured every life. When a Viking died, they were not gone, not truly. Their essence, their stories, remained. Sometimes in the halls of Valhalla, if they died with a sword in hand. Sometimes in the quiet corners of the farmstead, where the ancestors listened through the smoke. There were feasts for the dead, long nights of eating and drinking in their honor. They drank mead from horned cups, and they passed tales from one generation to the next. To the Viking, memory was sacred. A person only truly died when their name was no longer spoken. And so they lived through stories, through song, through the carvings on stone and the whisper of the wind. This is not the world of raiders and berserkers, not yet. This is the world of waiting, of growing, of believing. And in the stillness, something stirs, a hunger for more than fish and frost, a dream that lies beyond the horizon. The sea, always the sea, it pulled at them like a forgotten memory, whispering through the fjords with a voice as old as time. The Vikings did not fear it. They listened. They watched the way the gulls circled, the rhythm of the waves, the secrets carried on salt and wind. To them, the ocean was not an obstacle. It was a road wide, wild, and filled with promise. And so they built ships, not clumsy wooden boxes, but long ships, slender, swift, like serpents made of oak and iron. Their hulls flexed with the waves. Their sails caught the breath of the gods, and their oars beat in unison like the hearts of warriors dreaming of glory. These ships were more than tools. They were symbols, of freedom, of ambition, of escape from the hunger that haunted the winter. But not every Viking sailed to raid. That is the lie told by time. Many sailed to trade, to explore, to find new land for their growing families. They brought amber from the north, walrus, ivory, furs, soft as snow, and weapons forged in fire. In return, they took silks from the east, spices from lands they had never seen, silver coins etched with strange gods and distant kings. From Baghdad to Byzantium, Viking traders walked with the step of both merchant and myth. They settled, too, in Ireland, in England, in the green reaches of Scotland, not as conquerors, always, but as farmers, builders, and fathers. They cleared forests, raised barns, sowed barley, married local women. Towns like Dublin were born from these unions, not in blood, but in barter. The Viking was more than a raider. He was a shapeshifter, becoming what the land needed, what the future required. And yet, the fire still burned. In some hearts, the sea called not with promise, but with challenge, a chance to take, to prove, to rise above the lot of cold soil and salted meat. These were the men who painted their shields with wolves and ravens, who sharpened axes and named their blades. They were not wild. They were trained, disciplined, led by jarls who inspired loyalty with sylvan stories. When they sailed, it was with purpose, with plans whispered long into the night beside fires that crackled like bones. They struck monasteries, quiet places fat with gold and unguarded, but they struck not out of cruelty, but out of desperation and strategy. The monks recorded the raids in terror, calling the Vikings demons, heathens, a storm from the north. But they never saw the hunger, the failed harvests, the long winters that drove these men to sea. And still, behind the shields and the sails, life went on. Wives waited on the shores, raising sons and daughters, spinning wool, keeping the fire alive. They were not meek shadows. Viking women had power, real, recognized power. They could own land, divorce husbands, even lead in times of need. Some were shield maidens, though few. Most ruled their homes like queens, with a blade of wit and a spine of steel. They taught the children the sagas, the sacred runes, the names of stars, and those stars, they were maps. The Vikings navigated by them, reading the sky like scripture. They followed the sunstone, a crystal that revealed the sun even through cloud and fog. They read the waves, the wind, the birds. There were no compasses, no charts, only memory, instinct, and trust in the old ways. And what those old ways whispered was this, that beyond the known world lay something greater. So they sailed west, to Iceland, where black rock met boiling earth, and fire hissed beneath the snow, to Greenland, where frost bit deeper than hunger, and then, far beyond, ... They reached Finland. Yes, long before Columbus, the Vikings set foot on the shores of North America. They built huts, fought with native tribes, then vanished back into myth. But they were there. The stones remember. The sagas tell it true. They were not just raiders, not just farmers, not just dreamers. They were seekers of the edge, of where the world ended and began again. Behind every saga of sea and steel, there was a village, humble, flickering, alive. If you walked through one on a windless morning, you would not hear the clash of axes or the roar of warriors. You'd hear children laughing beside the stream, the steady thud of a loom, the crackle of bread baking on stone. The true rhythm of Viking life pulsed not in the roar of conquest, but in the quiet persistence of home. These were not kingdoms of marble or gold. Viking settlements grew from the earth itself. Their homes were timber and turf, with walls made of wattle and daub, warm against the snow but breathing with the world outside. There were no streets, only paths trampled by boots and hooves, no castles, only halls, where jarls held council beside fires that had burned for generations. The air carried the scent of pine and smoke, of wet leather and fermenting grain. In the fields, men and women worked side by side, bent over barley, guiding plows carved from ancient oak, pulled by patient oxen. Children scattered seeds or herded goats. Every hand had a task, every season a rhythm. Spring for sowing, summer for building, autumn for slaughter and storing, winter for stories and waiting. They worked with what they had. Nothing was wasted. Bones became tools, wool became thread, dyed with berries and bark. Iron was precious, hammered and reforged endlessly. Blacksmiths were revered, their forges glowing like the hearts of volcanoes. A well-made sword had a soul. A good knife could mean the difference between life and death. But not all work was toil. There was craft, beauty. The Vikings were artisans, too. Their carvings wound like serpents around door frames and cup handles. Animals danced across the hilts of blades. Dragons stretched across ships and stones. Even their runes, those simple lines carved in wood and rock, carried magic. Each letter was more than sound. It was a symbol, a spell, a prayer. In the evenings, when the day dimmed and the fire crackled, the village gathered. Elders told tales of the gods, of old battles, of the first time fire kissed the ice and life was born. These weren't just stories, they were the memory of the people, passed like a flame from mouth to mouth, century after century. Even the youngest child listened with wide eyes, knowing that one day the telling would fall to them. And sometimes the firelight flickered with something old ritual. The Vikings marked the turning of the sun, the passing of the dead, the return of the light. At Yule, they hung evergreens to call back the sun, lit fires to push away the darkness. They feasted not out of greed, but gratitude, for life, for the land, for each other. Mead flowed, sweet and sharp, and the air filled with the sound of harp strings and old songs that trembled like memories. Some rituals were solemn, a sacrifice of grain to the gods, a whispered offering to the spirits of the woods. They believed the world was alive not just with gods, but with hidden beings, elves in the forests, trolls in the mountains, wights that guarded barrows and rivers. The veil between worlds was thin, and respect was survival. You left offerings. You did not speak ill of the dark woods. You remembered that you were not alone. Even sickness had a spirit. When illness struck, it was not only a matter of flesh, but fate. Curses could twist a man's blood. Spirits could steal a child's breath. The healer, usually an older woman, came with bundles of herbs and words as old as stone. She knew what bark cooled fever, what root made pain fade. But more than that, she knew how to speak to what could not be seen. She was feared, respected, sometimes called Seconia, practitioner of the old magic. This magic, seer, was no illusion. It was part of their belief, tangled with fate and power. Women practiced it more often than men. They read the future in fire, in entrails, in dreams. They wore cloaks of feathers and carried staffs carved with runes. They could curse, "He'll call the wind," or so the people believed. And belief, in a world so raw and uncertain, was a kind of truth. And in this truth they found strength, not in riches, not in conquest, but in community, in connection, in a way of living so deeply tied to nature that every birth, every storm, every flame had meaning. This was the hidden heart of the Viking world. It beat not on the battlefield, but in the silence of snow, in the laughter around a hearth, in the hands of those who sewed, shaped, and sang. This was the world most never saw, the world that endured when the ships sailed, and after the swords fell. Beneath the stillness of the fjords, beneath the whisper of trees and the echo of footsteps on frost, there lived another force, quiet, but unshakable. It was not forged in fire, or sung in sagas. Break it, and you might live, but you would no longer be seen. In a world without kings to kneel to, without walls to hide behind, your name was your shield. If you lied, stole, betrayed, you brought shame not just on yourself, but on your family, your ancestors, your descendants yet unborn. And shame was a poison that spread quietly until no one would trade with you, fight beside you, or mourn you when you died. It was etched in the very bones of Viking life. Honor, invisible, yet heavier than iron, a thread that bound the Viking's soul to his land, his kin, and his word. A son insulted, a wife dishonored. These things could not be weighed in coin. They burned in the soul. And so, duels were fought, holmgang man to man, often on a small island or clearing, with witnesses, with rules, to the first blood, or to death. It was not about rage, it was about reputation, about restoring the balance of pride in the eyes of all who watched. What they had were gatherings of free men beneath open sky, where laws were spoken aloud, remembered, judged. There were rules for everything: how to resolve a feud, how much silver must be paid for an injured hand, how to divide inheritance between sons. She managed the farm when her husband sailed. She made deals, defended property, raised warriors. If wronged, she could seek divorce. Even Odin bowed to them. Even Thor could not escape their weaving. Fate was inescapable but not meaningless. To face your end with courage was the highest form of honor. It meant you had lived well and would die well. If widowed, she inherited. If insulted, she could demand satisfaction. Some were priestesses, some were seers. Some, if the sagas speak true, were warriors with spears and scars. Every promise, a thread in the great tapestry of fate. To break your word was to offend, not just men, but Odin himself. The Norse gods demanded courage but also truth, hospitality but also loyalty. You could worship them with sacrifice. Yes, but more than anything, you honored them by living with integrity, a mirror, a final measure of the life he had lived. For the Vikings did not fear being forgotten by gods. These laws were not perfect, but they were respected, and to break them was to break the thread of trust that held the village together. Every community had its thing, a circle of stones or a field marked by age. Here, disputes were heard, land divided, oaths sworn, blood debts measured. To be Viking was not just to fight, or farm, or sail. It was to live under a code unwritten, yet absolute. Honor was not about pride, it was survival. And yet, honor did not mean cruelty. It meant justice. The Vikings had no police, no towering courts. The law speaker held it all in his memory, a living archive of right and wrong. He spoke, and the people listened. When blood was spilled, vengeance followed, but not always with a blade, sometimes with Wergild, the Mampra, a system of compensation, measured not in fury, but in coin. If you killed a man, you paid. If you refused, the dead man's kin could seek blood in return. It was brutal, yes, but it was a form of balance, a world ruled not by chaos, but by consequence. Still, the blade was never far. For some, honor demanded not silver, but steel. And while men fought, women held their own realm of honor. A Viking woman could wield power sharper than a blade. Honor was not only personal, it was also spiritual. The gods were watching. Every oath was sacred, and behind the gods stood something older, the Norns, 3 sisters, cloaked in shadow, who wove the fate of every man and woman from the threads of time. And so, the Viking walked through life with death, always near but never feared. He greeted it not as an enemy, but as a companion. If he died with honor, he would rise again in song, his name spoken at fires, his deeds etched into memory. They feared being forgotten by each other, and that, more than sword or storm, was the secret to their endurance. Not strength, not savagery, but the weight of a name carried forward like a ship across centuries of silence. Before the world was, there was ice, and from that ice, the Vikings believed, all things were born flesh, fire, even fate. Their gods were not distant, golden beings perched in clouds, but ancient, flawed, and terrifying. They walked the earth, they bled, they made mistakes, and in their imperfection, the Vikings found themselves. He traded sight for knowledge, hung himself on the world tree for 9 nights to learn the runes. He was a god of poetry and war, of madness and magic, a father, but never gentle, a king, but never merciful. The gods were everywhere. He was neither evil nor could only change. Chaos in a world built on order. The Vikings did not hate him, they feared him, respected him, for without chaos, even gods could not grow. Was coming. Odin, with his dark hood and missing eye, wandered among men in disguise, seeking wisdom in whispers and sacrifice. The Midgard serpent would coil around the earth and rise from the sea. Odin would fall, Thor would die, slaying the serpent. Loki would betray. The sky would split, fire would devour the forests, and the ocean would swallow the land. Then there was Thorloud, loyal, fierce, wielder of Mjolnir, the hammer that crushed giants and sanctified marriages. Children knew their names before they could read. Their stories were lessons, warnings about pride, about patience, about the end of all things. They lived with a fierce clarity, like men sailing toward a storm they could not avoid but refused to meet with lowered sails. They carved their names into stones, not for vanity, but to defy the silence that followed. Bone for favor, a message sent across the veil. They gave to the gods, not what was easy but what hurt, what mattered, to leave something behind when even the sun was swallowed. Farmers loved him. Sailors called his name when storms rose. It gave them courage, for nothing lasted, not suffering, not glory. Even the gods were doomed. So why fear death? The Viking afterlife was as complex as life itself. It was not a reward, nor a sentence. It was a mirror, a golden fortress where the brave feasted and fought until the final battle. They did not believe in myth. They lived it. They would awaken each day, clash swords until they fell, then rise and drink beneath the chandeliers of spears. But even this was not eternal. Valhalla was only a waiting room for us. 2 humans would survive, hidden deep in the roots of the world tree, and they would begin again. He drank mead like a river drinks snowmelt, laughed like thunder rolling across the sky. He protected not just the gods, but the people. When lightning struck, it was said to be his doing, a warning or a blessing. No golden walls, no stained glass, just the raw world, worshipped in its own form. Fire was lit, prayers were spoken, and sometimes the gods answered, in dreams, in the sudden flight of ravens across the sky. Freya, golden and terrible, rode a chariot drawn by cats. She wept tears of amber for her lost lover, and received half the fallen warriors into her own hall. Goddess of love, yes, but also of death. She knew the secrets of seer, the deep magic, the power to see the unseeable and bend it toward desire. Women prayed to her with offerings of blood and honey. Men whispered her name in dreams. And Loki was the fire that could warm or destroy. The trickster, the shapeshifter. He birthed monsters and broke bonds. These gods were part of everyday life. They lived in the sagas, in the songs sung over spinning wheels, in the runes carved into doorposts and blades. Because the end, Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. To the Vikings, the world would not last forever. It would burn. Giants would rise. The wolf Fenrir would break his chains. But this was not despair. This was renewal. From the ashes, a new world would rise. Green, pure. This belief in an ending not just of life, but of time shaped the Viking heart. Instead, they embraced the now. And so their rituals carried deeper meaning. When they sacrificed animals, or in rare cases humans, it was not cruelty. It was offering balance, blood for rain. Sacred groves, stone circles, waterfalls hidden in forest, these were temples. The greatest rite of all was death. For those who died with honor, there was Odin's hall. Not all went there. Some went to Freya's field, others to hell, not a place of punishment, but of silence, cold, reflection. The gods, the fates, the magic, it was all a story they walked through daily, and in doing so, they left behind more than bones. They left behind meaning. Not all Viking stories were written with axes. Some were stitched into cloth, whispered beside cradles, or spoken through the quiet strength of women who shaped the world without needing to conquer it. And though her weapon may not have been forged of steel, her influence cut just as deep. She was a keeper of the hearth, but also of wisdom, a weaver of wool, but also of legacy. Where the man built the ship, the woman kept the fire burning for its return. In the shadows of the longhouses, in the silence between waves, there was another powerless song, but no less fierce. They could own property, demand divorce, reclaim wealth. With calloused hands and sharp eyes, she spun the wool, brewed the ale, dried the fish, carved the candles, educated the young. She was the first to rise, the last to sleep. She spoke as one who had stepped into the stream of time and returned with dripping hands. The girls knew how to bind wounds, how to measure grain by handfuls, how to tell which clouds meant a sudden storm. They learned the sagas by heart, not to recite, but to remember, to carry forward. For if the voice of the mother forgot the past, what hope did the future have? Their names ring like sparks in the dark Lagertha, fierce and unbroken, whose deeds were recorded even by Saxon enemies. Or, sister of Leif Erikson, who sailed to Vinland and, when surrounded by foes, grabbed a sword. Sometimes, she was sent off in a ship set ablaze, her possessions arranged around her jewelry, combs, weaving tools, perhaps a sacrificed animal, sometimes even a servant. The fire roared, smoke coiled toward the sky, and the villagers wept not just for a woman, but for the balance she had kept in their world, and beat her chest until the enemy fled, mistaking her for a spirit of war. When her sons sailed, she stood like a mountain behind them. Frigg, Odin's wife, the weaver of fate, who saw the future and said nothing. Even Hel, queen of the underworld, cold but not cruel, ruled with an iron stillness. These divine figures weren't symbols of softness, they were embodiments of complexity, desire, wrath, mercy, magic. The Vikings saw the divine in their women and the strength of the divine in their wives, mothers, daughters. When they fell, it was her voice that sang their names into memory. If a husband failed in his duty, she could walk away with her name, her reputation, and often her goods. This was not kindness. It was balance. A society that depended on every hand understood the value of each. The Viking woman was not chained to silence. She stood beneath the same sky, walked the same stone paths, faced the same winds. Marriage was not merely love, it was alliance, economy, and inheritance. Women brought land into unions, not just dowries. Inside the home, she ruled. And some women went further still. There were women who sailed not in legend, but in truth. Shield maidens, traders, healers, warriors, knew the herbs that healed and the ones that harmed. They whispered to the gods in voices older than stone. The Valvaseris prophetess, which was one of the most feared and honored women in Viking society. Clad in cloaks of feathers, draped in necklaces of bone, she traveled from village to village, reading fate in smoke and stars. People knelt before her not for blessing, but for truth. But even those who never touched a sword wielded something older, knowledge. They kept the sagas, remembered the bloodlines. In her chants and trembling visions, she became the voice of the Norns themselves. Men listened, even Jarls listened, for she did not speak as a mortal. Children learned from their mothers as much as from any sword-wielding father. Even in death, women held a place of power. When a noble woman died, she was not simply buried. And among the gods, too, the goddesses held dominion. Freya, both lover and warlord, no saga was complete without them. They were the silence before battle, and the voice that named the dead. They were the ones who remembered, the ones who endured, the ones who, long after the ships had rotted and the stones had cracked, still whispered to the wind through the threads they spun and the songs they passed on. There came a time when even the sea was not enough, when the fjords, the forests, the fields no matter how wide began to feel small beneath the growing weight of dreams. The old tales spoke of lands beyond the edge of maps, where grass grew higher than men, where rivers sang in unknown tongues, where no king's banner had ever flown. And so the Vikings sailed again, not for gold, nor vengeance, but for something more. They followed the cold breath of the northern winds, the birds that vanished into the mist, the stars that hung low and wide like open eyes. Iceland rose first, from the foggy land of black rock and boiling earth, where waterfalls fell like silver knives and the air smelled of ash. They settled it not with conquest, but with awe. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, heard of it from sailors who had drifted off course, who told of beaches and forests, of wild grapes and strange peoples. He followed the tale like a flame in the dark, sailing west until the waves soft, the air grew mild, and the shores rolled out before him like a promise fulfilled. Farms grew, lore traveled with them, and poets etched sagas into memory, as if afraid the land might forget. But still, they pushed west, to Greenland, where ice ruled the valleys like sleeping gods, and the summers whispered promises they rarely kept. Life there was harsh, but not impossible. The same question that once pulled them from dark forests into bright seas, now echoed through their descendants. A question that would one day stir other sails, other maps, other names. Priests came with books instead of swords. Some were welcomed, some were burned, but eventually the old gods were pushed into the corners of memory, like wolves retreating before fire. The Vikings brought their animals, their customs, their stories. The sagas remained, but now they were written by monks, who softened some truths and sharpened others. The longships were docked more often. The things became courts. The Jarls became lords beneath a foreign crown. They built turf houses with walls 4 feet thick, warmed by sheep and fire. It was not paradise, but it was freedom. A place where the old ways could survive, far from the crowns of Europe and the creeping touch of kings. Huts of timber, tools left in the earth, fragments of iron buried beneath centuries of silence. They traded and they fought with the native peoples. They hunted and harvested, but they did not stay. And then came or perhaps they simply felt the pull of home, of voices across the sea, calling them back. Whatever the reason, they left Vinland behind, like a dream half remembered upon waking, but the memory of that journey that reaching beyond the a place spoken of in wonder and disbelief. There, in the land we now call North America, the Vikings built temporary settlements. Why? Perhaps the winters were harsher than they'd hoped. Perhaps the resistance too fierce. It was not the conquest that mattered. It was the attempt, for in that moment, the Viking became not just a warrior, or a farmer, or a myth. He became a question. What lies beyond? What else might be waiting? And yet, the world was changing. The Christian cross crept slowly across the north, born not by war, but by time, by kings hungry for unity, by people weary of gods who gave no peace. Churches rose where sacred groves once stood. The runes gave way to Latin, but the Viking soul did not vanish. It lingered in the stories told by grandmothers beside dying embers, in the shape of a prow carved into a barn, in the hush that falls when snow begins to fall on old stone. Even in death, the old spirit walked, through fog that curled along the coast, through wind that whispered in forgotten dialects, through bones buried beneath fields. Their swords rusted but still pointed north, for the Viking did not seek to rule the world. He sought to feel it, to test its edges, to carve meaning into its silence, and to leave behind not monuments, but memory. Time moved on. The sails that once painted the northern seas grew still. The longships were left to rot in shallow creeks, their dragon heads softened by moss and rain. The great hulls collapsed, one beam at a time, until only earth and memory remained. And yet, when the mist rolls in over the fjords and the wind stirs the pine trees just right, you might swear you hear them still, the voices of a people who lived between storm and story. The Vikings are gone, but they were never truly erased. They live in bones buried beneath ancient farms, in tools found deep in frostbitten soil, in combs made of antler, still etched with delicate patterns, in wooden runes, blackened by fire, whispering names that no mouth speaks aloud anymore. Archaeologists dust away centuries to find not just artifacts, but echoes of laughter, of birth, of war cries, of songs sung by firelight when the world outside turned white with snow. They live in language, too, in words like sky, window, knife, and husband, in names that trace back to gods long forgotten, or ships that never returned. They live in the DNA of children in Ireland, in Scotland, in Normandy, even in North America, places touched by their oars, their footsteps, their longing. The Viking wasn't just Scandinavian. He became part of the lands he touched, in pushing a ship into black waters with no promise of return, in planting seeds in frozen ground and daring to hope they might grow. But to a longhouse lit with firelight, where voices rise in song beneath the smoke-dark rafters, where a mother cradles her child and hums an old rune, where a man sharpens his blade, not for war, but for the hunt that might feed them through the coming snow. The fire, in facing the unknown, not to conquer it, but to know it. But more than that, he became part of an idea of motion, of courage, not the kind found in the noise of battle, but in the silence before setting sail. What did the Vikings truly want? Not gold, not kingdoms. They wanted meaning. They wanted to know what waited beyond the next wave, beyond the next forest, beyond the last breath. Their myths weren't escapes, they were explanations. Their violence wasn't mindless, it was born of a world where every resource mattered, where hunger and honor lived side by side. Their tenderness, though quieter, was just as real, in the way they named their children after stars, in the way they waited on shorelines for months, in the way they sang the dead into eternity. They were neither demons nor angels. They were human, wild, wandering, flawed, brilliant. And the world they built was never meant to last in stone. It was always meant to pass into story. So now, as you sit with their memory, let your mind sail back not to the clashing of swords or the burning of villages. See the mountains rise behind them like ancient gods. Feel the cold wind snake between the pines. Smell the salt, the wool. Listen, not to the legends, but to the life between them. For in the end, that is where the Vikings truly lived. Not in the battles, not in the bones, but in the spaces we rarely look into, quiet, in the breath, in the courage to wonder. Their world is gone, but the silence remembers. And now, so do you.